If you talk about care days for people who have a care emergency, you talk about care shifts for people who sort of adjust their in-person hours around care. If I give that to my employees, they'll take advantage of it. And I say, you're absolutely wrong. I said, the people who will take advantage of it are your bottom 30 or 40% of employees, but they're already taking advantage of everything that you give them. Those people need to be managed out. Your top 30% of employees, they're not going to take advantage of it. They're your high performers. They like their job. They want to do it well, but they also want to be super involved parents. And those are the people that you're most at risk of losing. Nobody in the bottom 30% is leaving because nobody else is going to hire them. It's those top performers. And when you start thinking toward those top performers, it just, it changes your mind shift, and I think ultimately, 5 days a week, it's a bit short-sighted, because do you really want people to show up in the office every day, or do you really want people to collaborate as a team and work at a very, very high level? And I think most managers would say it's the latter.
Today, I'm joined by Paul Sullivan, founder of the Company of Dads, a platform dedicated to supporting fathers who take on primary caregiving roles, challenging outdated stereotypes and redefining modern fatherhood. Before launching this movement, Paul spent 25 years as a journalist, including 13 years writing Wealth Matters for the New York Times. He also is the author of 2 books and a frequent guest on NPR, CNN, Marketplace, and many others. In this episode, we'll explore Paul's career transition, how he has navigated this shift, and what he's learned about success, balance, and personal growth. We'll also talk about the evolving role of fathers, the cultural change that is necessary for that, and how midlife can serve as an opportunity for reinvention. Welcome, Paul, to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. I appreciate it.
What inspired you to transition from being a journalist at the Times that you've done for many years very successfully, and you had a stellar following of your column, to founding the Company of Dads?
I mean, like many things, for many people who made changes, it was COVID, and COVID was this moment of sort of realization. But it started a lot earlier than that. I was established at the Times. I had 2 kids. My first book, Clutch, had come out. It did really well. I was giving keynote talks. I mean, life was really cranking along. And my wife, who works in asset management, she said, I want to start my own firm. And I said, you 100% should do it. Like, you're great at what you do. Go ahead and do it. And I said, well, you've always been the high earner. I think you're going to start your firm today. And she said, yeah, that makes sense. And she said, what are we going to do with the girls? We had 2 then. We have 3 now. I said, I don't know. I'll become the lead dad. And she said, what does that mean? I was established enough in my career at the Times where I could own a good portion of my time. I could, columnists do the same day every week. Books take 2 years to write. Nobody calls you up on a Tuesday and says, can you give a keynote talk on a Thursday? It just doesn't happen. It was all planned out. And then between that and my dad and sort of really shuffling things around, it worked. But the problem there was, from 2013 until 2020, when COVID hit, I was an undercover lead dad. Why was I undercover? Like, I was a go-to parent. I was there at my daughter's. I was still working at a high level. A second book came out in 2015. I took on more responsibility at the time. My career was thriving. I was undercover for 2 reasons. One, in my community, I saw most of the caregiving was being done by moms or paid caregivers. I didn't know that there was a role for dads in there. So I kept quiet about it. And second, at work, I mean, when you get to a place like the New York Times, it's amazing. But other people want your job. And so I didn't feel like I could be open and honest, even though most of my favorite editors, my closest editors, they were working moms, they were dads, they were parents. They surely would have understood. So this is my own sort of, issue, my own sort of insecurity. So I just kept it under wraps. And of course, when COVID hit, that all fell apart, because being a lead dad the way I was, still working full time, still, I needed my kids to be in school, or I needed them to be in summer camp. Or if they weren't in school or camp, we would make a plan. And, most kids, when they're young, they're homesick for a day or 2. Anybody can figure that out. But COVID became this indistinguishable period of time. Like, when is this work from home thing going to end? When is this lockdown going to end? And nobody had any answers. And so that's when I sort of started thinking, like, what is there to support men like me? And of course, there's nothing. Lots of stuff for moms, all the stuff for parents, really for moms. And the only stuff for dads are dads in distress. They've been incarcerated, they've drank too much. like super important stuff, but not what I was trying to do. Fatherhood is incredibly important and sometimes fun. So why wasn't there an equivalent community for men like me? And then I did the second thing I did what a journalist would do. I said, how many guys out there fit my definition of a lead dad as, that go-to parent? And that was a light bulb moment, because there are 25 million men in the United States who are lead dads or could be lead dads. And that's a third of all fathers. And what's driving that number? It's being driven by guys in their 30s who want to work and live differently. And I had this light bulb moment. I live in Fairfield County, Connecticut. People live here so that they can commute into New York City and pay lower property taxes than if you lived in Westchester. That's why people live here. That parking lot in my town emptied out, and it's never filled up again. So I knew that there would be this other group of dads where I felt guys in their 40s and 50s who would restructure their work life so that they could be more present with their kids, be more present with their families. And that was really, the starting off point to, I kind of, thought about it for 2 years, but in February of 22, I left my column at the Times, started the company of dads, and here we are today.
So how do you define what a lead dad is? Because we had that conversation when I was on your podcast, and I said, I don't know, I do a lot of the caregiving, but my wife does obviously too. Am I a lead dad or not?
The first thing I say, Stephen, is any guy who is asking himself that question, chances are he is a lead dad. But the way we describe it is the lead dad is the go-to parent, whether he works full-time, part-time, or devotes all of his time to his family. Second part, as we say, in many cases, he's there to support his wife or partner in whatever they're doing. We say many because we know that 18% of fathers in the United States are divorced, widowed, or otherwise single. And then the last part is we say he's always an ally to working moms and caregivers in the office. And so when we go in and give keynote talks to parenting groups, that's raising awareness. But we do something, deeper than that. We also go in and work with managers. As I say, like, you could pay, fill in the blank for the consulting company. You could pay them millions and millions of dollars, have the world's greatest HR policy, but it only takes a handful of managers thinking in an old, antiquated way to ruin that policy. Because that old, antiquated way things come out of their mouths like this, like, boy, when I was at your level, I never would have taken time off. Or do you have any idea how many things I missed in my kids' lives to be here at work? Or my favorite, of course, is when a woman goes to a manager and says, I'm pregnant. There's one and only one correct answer. This is graded. You can't, there's no curve here. The only correct answer is congratulations. And so when we work with managers, it's very much, I'm an optimistic guy. Most people are happily decent. I believe that if you give people the tools, they'll change. And when we tell companies, like, why do you want to do this? You're like, you want to do this because it's a bottom line issue. You don't want your top performers to leave, and they will leave because COVID has made, everything after COVID has made life more stressful. Resources are different. Care is different. If you have a sick kid, you used to just, shove the kid off on the bus, go to school. You don't want to be that parent anymore because what if your kid has, flu or COVID? So it's changed everything. And so, but really that lead dad, it doesn't mean that he's going to do everything. It means that he's really involved.
So do you see additional challenges now that a lot of employers are forcing people to come back into the office 4 or 5 times, a week? How is that changing the dynamics, and what do we need to work on as a society to make it easier for working parents or, lead dads, but I think, in the same way, probably lead moms as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's misplaced that going back in the office 5 days a week. There's a guy at Stanford. He's an economist. His name is Nick Bloom. He spent his entire career researching, ways that people work. And of course, COVID was his moment in the sun. And all of his research shows that the optimal number of days in the office is 3. 3 days of work in the office, but have it to be really focused and targeted. We're going to come in the office and we're not all going to sit on Zoom calls. We're not going to sit on Teams meetings. We're actually going to do work as a team. And then the other 2 days, if you've hired people that you trust, hire people that you think can do a good job, use those other 2 days to do all of that thought work. But to be clear, being a lead dad or being a working mom, lead mom, that's not a substitute for childcare. People still need to have childcare. And so much being a lead dad isn't, yes, are you caring for your kids? Of course you are. But it's also about that mental load. If you're in the office, and let's say you're in the office 5 days a week, and there's a call that your kid is sick and has to come home from school, does it always have to be the mom to do it, or can it be the dad to do it? It's creating an environment like, okay, I'll come into the office 5 days a week, but parenting is important to me. And, the things that we talk about for parents can also be extended to caregivers. Caregiving is important to me. And when companies understand that, they're going to get more engaged, dynamic workers.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you saying is that employers should create an environment that allows people to be able to have the flexibility to care for their family. And if they do, then they'll actually get more loyal and harder working employees. And the time at home doesn't mean that they're going to be twiddling their thumbs or watching Netflix. It actually means that they're going to be taking care of their family and then actually maybe even working harder at different times to be able to accommodate the employer that's helping them. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
it creates an environment of openness and honesty. And as I said, nobody's ever taken a job at a competitor for a 3% raise. If somebody leaves for a 3% raise, it means they really hate their manager. They really hate their job. People leave for a 30% raise. There's nothing you can do about that. But I think, the fundamental issue here is, the managers that are making these decisions, the most senior people, the CEOs, the C-suite, they're often in their late 50s into their 60s. They suffer from what any behavioral economist can identify in a second, and that is confirmation bias. They got to that level doing a certain number of things, and they believe, therefore, that you should do those same things. Managers will eventually adapt to what's going on because they're going to manage for performance. They're going to manage to retain their best workers. But the problem is COVID accelerated so many things that were already percolating under the surface, and it accelerated them so quickly that managers haven't had a chance to adapt. Do I think people would be living and working in a different way without COVID in 10, 15 years? But COVID showed us that we could be highly productive at home. It showed us that we could be more engaged with our families. And it showed us that for once, we could sort of break down that wall. And it wasn't like when I go to work, I'm my work self. When I'm at home, I'm my everything else self. It just wasn't possible anymore. People didn't have home offices. People were, working at their kitchen table and their kids were going back and forth. So it's that acceleration that I think managers are struggling the most with, and they'll eventually get there.
Yeah, I totally see that. One of the last day jobs that I had, right? And it was probably one of the moments why I didn't want to do this anymore and wanted to do my own thing. I was at another 8 a.m. Monday morning sales call with tons of people on it. I had very little to contribute at that point. And I'm like, why am I here? I'm trying to get my kid ready to go to school. Obviously, the CEO of the company does not have kids anymore at home and doesn't give to that other people actually have to get their kids ready, right? And so I think a lot of companies are very short-sighted by having these kind of policies in place or these kind of meetings in place, or late meetings, early meetings, a call with Tokyo, in the middle of the night, whatever that is. It just makes it impossible for people to care for their families. And if they can't care for their families, they're not going to be able to be good workers because they don't get enough sleep and their family is unhappy or they're in distress and their mind and thoughts are with them rather than with the work. You made this transition from being a high-profile journalist at the Times and writing books to now being an entrepreneur and advocate for involved dads. How did you make that transition, and how did that emotionally work for you? I think a lot of people are struggling when they have to, or when they're making that kind of shift.
Look, I think I owned it, and I knew it would be challenging because when you work, I grew up wanting to write for the New York Times. That was my dream. High school, college, I went to graduate school thinking I was going to get a PhD in history, and I realized I don't really want to do this. I want to be a journalist, and it worked out. And so we can't deny that sometimes you work for a place and there is a lot of cachet associated with it. Saying Paul Sullivan, New York Times columnist, that meant a lot. On the cover of both of my books, it says Paul Sullivan, New York Times columnist. I joke and say, like, it was hard the day that they turned off, paul.sullivan@nytimes.com. That's, you send somebody an email, they'll get back to you when it says, at nytimes.com. But I thought, you know what? I've had a great run. There's no guarantee to anything, in life. I was in my late 40s and I said, why not, go out on my own terms? And I have this, this other idea that I think, will have a big impact. Again, I've got 3 daughters. I want them to be able to live a life where if they're the lead mom, fantastic. If they marry a lead dad, I don't want it to be a big deal. I want to try to, really lead, cultural change here. And I thought, I've just got to, take that. I had an amazing run, I loved every minute of it. And going forward, I'm going to be, someone else. Is it still, are there moments where people say like, what do you do? And I say, well, I was a New York Times columnist, a longtime New York Times business columnist, and now I, so it's coming up. Of course there is, but that's that's human nature. It's who we are, but it's sort of having that self-awareness to own it and to know that that was an achievement and it's something you're proud of. And now, I'm Paul Sullivan, founder of the company Dads.
Yeah, I think that this is a very hard one for most people. Over-identification with the job and the company that they've worked for. And when that, for whatever reason, no longer works for them, making that transition is very hard. And then often I see with my clients that they then want to go back to a position like that because it is who defines them, rather than really looking inwards and defining themselves as who they are, rather than the New York Times columnist or the Goldman Sachs partner.
Yeah, and it's tough. It's like we often, particularly as men, we sort of identify by what we do more than, who we are. And that can be, a real challenge. We have to acknowledge that in certain circles, what we do is an identifier. And it's neither good nor bad. It just is what it is. And so how do we then, with that knowledge, move forward as to how we want to identify ourselves?
One of my other guests, she talked about leaving loudly. So when her daughter is sick, or when her daughter has a soccer match and it's 4:00, and instead of just quietly, heading out, she will be in on the Zoom call or on the meeting saying, it's 4:00. My kid has a big soccer game. I'm going to go now to watch the soccer game, supporting her. I'll see you tomorrow. So that it becomes culturally much more acceptable to being that lead parent. I think that's very important.
We've done a lot of work on this, and what she's doing is so crucial because, one, it's good for her. She's being honest. She's not sneaking out. I mean, she's not doing anything wrong. She's going to see her child play soccer or do whatever. I mean, there's a totally wonderful thing. You don't want to have a whole, company of sociopaths who have children and then never see them. That's not, what you want to play. But it's more important for all the other people on that Zoom call, all the other people in the office, because then they say, okay, wait a second, look at her. She's in this super senior role. She's secure. She's not going to be fired. If she can do it, maybe I can do it. And that starts to change the conversations, because, my wife would tell me stories, coming up in financial services. It wasn't just the men who were her managers. It was the women who were her managers, women who were like, I'm about to give birth and I'm on my BlackBerry. And they weren't doing it as a joke. Like, they wanted to show that they were working all the time. But what that woman, those senior managers were doing, they were modeling a certain expectation. And if you are a high performer and you want to one day get to that level, what are you going to do? You're going to say, okay, I guess that's what I have to do. And so when, the person you had on who is leaving loudly, that is so crucial, because all those other people who aspire to have her job one day will say, okay, you can do it this way. You can be honest about this. One of the most pernicious things that ever came was the idea of the super parent, that the parent can do everything. And we know that's not true. We know that super parent had a nanny. We know that super parent had somebody to clean their house. We know that super parent maybe had a spouse who worked less or had a less, time demanding job, but they weren't honest about that. They're like, we can do it all. Like, that's not good. You just say, like, this is how I do it. This is how it works for me. And then people are like, oh, okay, I can see that now. I can see a path forward. Maybe I could put those supports in place so I could one day have that very senior role.
Yeah, and another podcast guest of mine, Larry, who I had on the previous episode, he said that he has very simple life goals, that he raises thriving kids, not rich kids, but thriving kids. And I think that if more of us would take that to heart, which I think that most of us internally probably do feel that that's one of our primary goals, then being a parent is something, or being a lead parent would be something that we could really be proud of.
I had this guy that I did feature as a lead dad of the week. He was a chief technology officer at this enormous telecom company. He was working all the time, making tons of money, and he had 2 kids. He wasn't, even when he was home, he wasn't present because he was always thinking about what they're doing. He has a heart attack. And he has one of those heart attacks that you kind of have in the movies where
Mm-hmm.
like you're fading out and you're like, holy shit, this is it. Like I'm done. Like I'm, the bright light, all this. And I said, you remember that period? I said, yeah. I said, when you were remembering that period, were you thinking about work? And he said, no. I was thinking about my sons and I was thinking about my wife and I was thinking about what they were going to do if they couldn't bring me back. And it changed how he thought about work. And he ended up they had a third child, a daughter, is much more involved. But here's a crucial part. He said, when I went back, my CEO said, do you want a less stressful job? Do you not want to be the CTO anymore? And he says, no. He says, you could, there's nothing against the guy who sweeps the floor at night, but you could give me the job of the guy who sleeps the floor at night, and I would overwork myself. I would try to have the best floor. It's just how I'm wired. I have to change myself. And that's what he did. And he made this commitment to sort of change himself, to like when he was home, to only do work in his office, when he was with his family, to be present with his family, to exercise more, to eat better, but really to focus on being present, because he knew like it was a trap. Like take a less stressful job. That wasn't who he was. He knew himself. But to me, I always remember like on his deathbed, he didn't think about work. On his deathbed, he didn't think about, oh shit, I wish I could have finished that PowerPoint presentation. He thought about his family, and that's how all of us will be. And that's why I think it's so important to like get rid of terms like work-life integration, work-life balance. And you have life. That's the only term we should use. You have life, and you can calculate the number of hours you have each week, subtract out, how many of those hours you believe you're going to be sleeping, and that's what you have. And then you just do the math and like, how am I going to divide this up? And when you start thinking in those terms, work is super important. Parenting is super important. You can do both, but how do you balance it? Knowing that some weeks work is going to take up more time and parenting and relationships is going to take up more time. And that's okay. But think about it in that holistic way and move forward with that.
I agree with that. And I think it's really more even about energy than time, right? So when my oldest was a teenager, I had a really big job. I had 5 divisions globally, and I was traveling all over the world. I had thousands of employees. And in those kind of jobs, you solve problems all day long. So I was always physically there when I was supposed to be. And we had dinner together as much as I could. But by the time we had dinner, of course, your teenager is not going to open up and talk about everything that they want to share and all the issues that they have. They're going to be a pain in the ass. And, I was not present enough because I was dealing with problems all day long. All I wanted was a nice meal and appreciate hanging out with my family. But of course, life as a parent is not like that. And so thinking back, or how I changed my life, was really so that I am now have the energy to be present with my family. Of course, I'm human, so it doesn't happen every day, right?
Right.
But more now than I had before. And I think that that's an important lesson, hopefully, that other people can integrate as well.
I mean, it's an important lesson for you to share with other people, but it's also important for your kids to see, for your partner to see, because, as I say, kids, they don't really listen to what we tell them. They'll listen, but if you want them to act, they watch what we're doing. So if we're modeling how we want them to be in the world, they're watching us. But I agree, you got to give yourself grace. You're not going to be 100% perfect all the time. But when they see that you're really focused on them, you're really focused on those times together. And, just as, the guest you talked about who leaves loudly at work when she has to go do something for her kids. If I have to take a call or my wife has to take a call, we sort of break that third wall and say, okay, I'm sorry, excuse me, this is a work call. I've been waiting for this call all day. I'll be 5 or 10 minutes and then I'll come back. And you acknowledge it. You don't take it at the table. You don't do this. And you say, and then it also has that other benefit of, with your children, you're starting to talk to them about money skills. You're starting to talk to them about, how do we make money? How do we afford this house? How do we afford that vacation? How do we afford the car that gets you to and from school?
What advice would you give to men navigating these career changes and family dynamics and this personal reinvention in midlife?
I said, be honest with yourself. I mean, the worst person to lie to is yourself, and to say like, why am I doing this? What does it mean? Try to be as reflective as you can. And that's hard because most of us, get out of college, we get a first job, and then we go, and, what they call, some people say they're racing in the comparathon. What matters? And, I had this day, on Saturday, with two of my daughters, my oldest and my youngest, and we dropped my youngest off at a play date in 30 minutes from my house, and there's no sense to drive home. So my oldest daughter said, "Why don't we go out to lunch?" And so we went out to lunch. That was like, there's so many things I don't remember from last week because every week can be a blur. But I'll remember that lunch, the hour and 20 minutes we spent getting a pizza at a nice Italian restaurant. I'll remember that lunch for years. And that's how we want to build, life. You have to do some of the mundane stuff. We all have to work. We all have to make money. But what do you remember? You remember the great victories at work. Well, try to apply those same principles to life. And if you're reinventing yourself, what is really going to matter? And I think for many people, it's going to be, family, or it's going to be a hobby. It's going to be something that they're personally, passionate about, and step into that.
Thank you so much for having you on the podcast. This was a lot of fun. You brought great insights into what a lead dad is like, but I think it goes beyond that. It's really going, around parenting and the benefits that the organizations can derive from people that are thriving with their kids together rather than being slaves to the company. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Stephen, for having me on. It was thoroughly enjoyable. It was a great call.